G'day and welcome to the Transport Leaders Podcast. I'm Graham McCabe. I'm a transport planner and traffic engineer with 30 years working in the Asia Pacific and Australasia.
Hello, I'm Russell King. I'm a transport strategist and transport policy expert. I've spent the last 20 years or so working on interesting transport policy challenges.
Okay, Russell, what are we going to talk about today?
Graham, we're going to talk about something called asset management and why many transport places, agencies, jurisdictions, etc., are so bad at it.
Okay, so this is going to be a really sexy podcast. We're going to get so many views and listen to it. So we better dull it down a little bit so people aren't jumping too far out of their chairs, yeah?
Yeah, let's talk about it in a kind of dumb way. Why do we have so many potholes? Why do our trains always late due to broken down engines, signaling problems, broken tracks, all of those sorts of things? Why are our buses all old and grotty? All of those sorts of things. Those are all things that are around asset management, managing at the assets that we have. And why are we so often so bad at it?
All right, so let's start at the basics. And assets are the entirety of the transport system. So from your pavements, your street lights, your traffic lights and signs and poles, your railway stations, buses, as you said, all the infrastructure and networks that support them. So
And
it goes on forever. So basically,
it
if it's
does.
a thing and it relates to transport, it's an asset.
Well, what's interesting as well is it also includes digital assets, which are becoming increasingly important as well. So it's not just the sort of physical assets. If you've got things like software helping to run your train systems, which is ubiquitous pretty much everywhere now, those things are an asset as well. Software has a lifespan, needs to be maintained, etc.
Well, the software has a lifespan which is well and truly beyond its lifespan. I think we're into zombie territory with a lot of software that's running systems these days. Things that were developed on mainframe computers back in the 1950s and 60s, legacy systems that are still around doing things with very few people who know how to actually read and write the code.
Yes. And these are all problems, right? They are all problems moving forward. And as I say, we're not good at managing them. So today we're going to try and unpick about why do we have these systems that we can no longer maintain and build on?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So when we start out with a new project or system, somebody determines the things that we're going to purchase, and often, you and I have talked about gold plating and picking the thing that looks nice, is shiny, but it doesn't necessarily have value long-term maintenance.
That's right. So there is what's interesting here is in the example you've just given there, you can end up with the worst of both worlds, which is that you have a very high upfront capital cost for paying for the asset, and it also has high maintenance costs as well. So that's not a good formula for running an effective transport system. That's a very expensive way of doing things. On the other hand, what you don't want to do is be a cheapskate in purchasing the asset up front, so cutting corners, using substandard materials, etc., and then having a very large maintenance bill to maintain the asset as a consequence. That's a terrible answer too.
Yeah. So this gets us into the fun territory of total cost of ownership.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're purchasing a new asset or you're getting it built, you want to think about how much does it cost to create, purchase, construct, and then how much is it going to cost you over its life, and then how much is it going to cost to replace, to start the cycle again. And I think it's the last one where we actually do the worst, is because if you gold plate in the right way, you can make something future-proof, and your replacement cost in 10, 20, 50, 100 years is not as great. So if you think old bridges were built to last 100, 150 years, and a lot of them are now coming to the end of their useful life.
Yes.
I'm not sure that we would build a bridge to that kind of longevity standard these days. Or would
Why not? Why?
Well,
Why do you think that? It's an interesting question.
Well, yeah. So you look at the design life of concrete assets is 50 to 100 years. And a lot of the old bridges have had loads on them that were not thought of or designed for at the time. So, we have bigger, heavier trucks. We have bigger, heavier, faster trains. And so there was what I think would be considered to be a lot of, well, we don't know what the future holds, so let's, prepare for it. So the classic is the Sydney Harbour Bridge. It was built with room for 6 lanes of traffic, 2 tram lines and 2 railway lines, without them forecasting, anywhere near the volume of people and traffic that go across it every day. Yeah, and it's is about to hit 100 years recently, and it's had a lot of strengthening and maintenance over the years, and it's iconic, so they want to make sure that it stays up. So it has a lot of investment in its asset maintenance, but it has had periods where the maintenance hasn't been as good as it could.
So, yeah, and that picks up an interesting point then. Okay, so let me question you. So total cost of ownership. So this sounds straightforward, right? Let's look at the total cost of ownership across the life cycle of the asset. So from installation, building, construction, all the way through to replacement at the end, and the maintenance all in between.
Yeah.
So is it simple as we just pick the lowest total cost of ownership? Is that the way forward? Or is there something we're missing?
Well, it depends on your objectives. So, again, if you want something that's upgradable, then you wouldn't necessarily have the lowest TCO.
Yes.
Whereas if you want something that's going to be completely replaced, so a bus, for example, if you're buying an electric bus today, you could buy an electric bus that will last 20, or you could buy one that will last 10 years. You don't have to so much worry about, will a road exist to run the bus on in the future? So you're not worrying about the replacement. You're worrying about, can I find the replacement, and is the total cost less? Whereas a railway bridge, you're worrying about, well, if the life is 5 years shorter than planned, what's the impact of the cost? And also 50, 100 years time, when somebody comes to replace this, how easy is it going to be?
Yeah, so I agree with all of that. There's also another factor for me, which is the performance of the asset that you need to be thinking about, right? Because performance of an asset varies across its lifespan as well. And it really depends on your sort of performance objectives. So if you're, the Japanese high-speed rail Shinkansen, if you're a few seconds late into the station, you are late, right? The specification for your assets in terms of reliability needs to be very high. You need to have very reliable assets all the way through. Otherwise, you're not going to be meeting those things. Now that comes with a price, but it's what their objectives are in terms of their reliability. But if you're, on the other hand, you're in most of our Anglo-Saxon countries where, within 5 minutes is pretty good in terms of our rail services, reliability might not be as important to you. You're looking for, say, maybe 90% on-time running as opposed to, Shinkansen, which is like 100% on-time running with a much tighter definition. Then your reliability becomes much, varies, and that defines the specification of your asset, doesn't it, as well? So you might pay more because you're looking for that. What your objective here is critical.
Yeah. So and that comes down to how you cost things. So what value are you placing on that reliability? And it feeds through to how much you need to do in terms of inspections. So, the Shinkansen, for example, I think they detector trains go across every segment of track every 2 weeks. And and they they're very precise in all their proactive maintenance every night.
Which is a key thing as well. Proactive, right? Proactive maintenance. Yeah. So better explain that. What proactive versus what?
Well, so it's proactive versus reactive, but I know, we talk about technology a lot, but one of the things that technology enables you to do is you can actually start putting detection equipment onto every vehicle rather than having specialist vehicles to do.
Yeah.
If you're looking for track defects or defects in your overhead wiring, you can start putting that equipment onto every vehicle, so it's always being monitored. And then you need good digital assets in order to be able to, monitor and react. But so proactive maintenance is part of strategic asset management, where you set performance criteria about how often things are inspected. So if you have something that has to be inspected the manufacturer says every 10,000 kilometers, then at an absolute minimum, you're doing the inspection every 10,000 kilometers rather than waiting for a defect in not necessarily related in terms of numbers, but, a defect in a wheel, waiting for a defect in a wheel to turn up is reactive maintenance. Whereas taking your vehicle or your piece of road out of service, using technology to monitor it while it's in service, so that you know what its state is on a regular basis, which is based on the designed performance of the asset.
Yeah, so there's different maturity levels here, right? So reactive is it's broken, I'll fix it. That's kind of the reactive kind of piece. Then there's the next bit of, we think this thing will break after every 5 years, so therefore we'll do maintenance on it every 4.5 years, right? So that it doesn't break. That's kind of that proactive maturity level kind of 2 kind of piece. But then, as you say, there's the data-led proactive approach, where you are actually looking at each individual asset and you are seeing, okay, this rail is showing signs of maintenance challenges much faster than we were expecting. Therefore, we're going to bring forward the maintenance regime on it and treat it accordingly, because it wouldn't survive to, what we were planning to do in terms of its maintenance. Is that?
Yeah, and there's actually one level above that, which is using complex data availability to also reduce unnecessary maintenance. So
Give us an example.
if you have, I don't actually have one off the top of my head, so I'll just describe it in.
We'll edit this in later. That's okay. All good.
Yeah, so you could have a manufacturer specification which is different to the performance. So you may have something that's designed to run at a certain speed, and it's actually, I'll use a car, for example. So you are supposed to get your car serviced every 10,000 kilometers every year. And that, for example, has carried through into some brands of electric cars. You need to have an annual maintenance service on it. Electric cars have many fewer moving parts that fail, need cleaning, need lubricants replaced, this type of things. So you get some brands which say, well, if you want to keep your warranty, you need to come in for the annual service, which is, through a scammy relationship with a dealer. Or you have other car companies which go, actually, our vehicles don't need maintenance at all. Just do what your state regulatory agency requires in terms of getting your brakes tested and things like that. So that's the difference between a regular framework for asset management for an electric car would be to go, okay, well, manufacturers said I have to have an annual service. And then you going, well, actually, it's an electric car. It doesn't need an annual service. I will service it based on, the probability of things breaking or needing software upgrades.
Which is problematic for the historical maintenance support for vehicles, right? It's one of the things that's a challenge for the sector. We're expecting to need a lot less mechanics as we move to more and more electric vehicles.
Yes. Don't become a mechanic. If you're 17, I mean, if you want to work on classic cars, become a mechanic. Not if you want a lifelong career. No, sorry, as a car mechanic, not as a machinery mechanic.
Okay, so don't become a mechanic. Don't do anything that's vulnerable to AI. There's not a lot of jobs left.
Yeah, universal basic income. Here we come. That's okay. We can just spend all day podcasting.
Yeah, we'll do.
Competing with the AI podcasters that already exist.
Indeed, and are doing a lot better than we are. Right.
Okay. Back to topic.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I find fascinating is how bad transport agencies are getting the basics right, or how they struggle to get even the basics right. So the foundation number one that you need to have if you're going to do any asset maintenance and asset strategy, etc., is know what assets you own. Right? What assets do you actually have? And the number of transport agencies which haven't got a clue about what they actually own properly is
Oh,
very high.
yes. Yeah. Having worked on asset databases, yes. And this is human fallibility is your primary problem. So the people who are specifying the asset know the asset exists. The people who are installing the asset know the asset exists. The people who are doing the regular inspections on the asset know the asset exists or doesn't.
Yes. But the
So,
thing is,
it's a
that
really
knowledge,
boring basic thing of recording information.
yes. And that's actually really important, because the second thing that you need to know is A, that you own an asset and you have an asset. And then the second thing is, in order to understand, to look after it, is what condition is the asset in, right?
Yes.
When am I going to need to replace it? When am I not going to need to replace it? When am I going to need to maintain it? All those sorts of things. You need to know, A, what asset you have and what condition it's in. And a lot of that information just doesn't exist at the moment in many places. It's, where we've got a low level of maturity in asset management.
Well, I would say the information exists. It's probably just not organized very well at a structural level. So, for example, the roads people will have asset databases that will tell them when the pavement's installed, what the crash barrier is, etc. And the surveillance officers will check that those things are still there and still in good grip. So, at a local level, the information is good and quite detailed. At a strategic level, because if you're trying to do an asset management database that you're using for procurement or funding or reporting purposes, it's very hard to get all the nuances of the information. And so you start getting, if you have a pole surveillance officer who has to drive 2,000 kilometers a week and look at, every piece of roadside or the cat's eyes along the roadside, the reflective markers. Are you really going to care if, it's 191 or 195 cat's eyes in a section of road? Yeah, or it could be something as simple as you hit the wrong key and you were tired from doing lots of inspections.
I
So
agree.
this is
But
where
is it,
AI becomes really good, because the surveillance officer can focus on driving the road and finding big things, and AI is good at just going, yep, cat's eye, cat's eye, cat's eye, cat's eye, cat's eye.
so do you even need the driver? Is this another use case for autonomous vehicles?
There will always be features which are unusual. So I think you do need a person who can review the information that the AI is generating, so they can check the footage. So AI in train fault detection. Japan Railway Journal, really good episode about a month ago about using AI in train maintenance. So, but it doesn't like any AI. It's complicated algorithm of multiplying things together. So it doesn't handle unusual things. So that's why you need humans, is you need humans to handle unusual things. So either the AI flags, I don't understand this thing, or the humans in the vehicle with the AI, and they go, oh, better stop and pull over and,
It's the edge cases, isn't it?
look at this. It is the edge cases, yeah.
Right. It's
Yeah.
the bit where there
So,
isn't large amounts of training data to train the AI. And so it basically hasn't got the experience of knowing what to do with these things, right? So it doesn't yet have the smarts to be able to do what a human does and sort of think about the thing and work out what to do.
yeah. Well, yeah, and AIs don't have intuition.
Yeah.
They don't have the human capability to go, there's something not quite right here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. 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 So getting back to the original point. So the data is really good at a local level. It's when it gets aggregated. So, one project I had to do, which was a Y2K project. Yes, I am old.
I remember
Cleaning it.
mates on Y2K
Cleaning it.
projects as well. So I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
old as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Well, we're the same age, but changing two-digit codes within a database to four-digit codes.
It was very exciting work.
Yeah, very exciting work. So that was one component of it. But then another component was costing up the total asset replacement when the accounting standards changed. And the data was all over the place. And this is 4,000 assets in the state of New South Wales, each of which at the time would have cost about $2 to $10 million each to replace. Highly trained, highly skilled people who knew this infrastructure really well were the ones entering the data into the database. Was a mess.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So we ended up doing a lot of cleaning, but that was one asset. And there's historically every different type of asset had its own type of database because it was collecting its own asset things. And people across the world have tried to create strategic total asset databases where they are capturing everything.
I certainly,
and that's what building information systems are supposed to do. And it's really, really hard. And it's really hard to get right.
Yeah. And I think what backs up this, it's not a transport thing, it's a human failing, is that certainly within the public sector, the maturity of asset management across the public sector, not just in transport, but in health, in education, in the prison service, across the board, is very low, right? It is a transport problem. It is a government-wide problem. Which is why we have prisons that are falling down, or schools that are falling down, or hospitals that are rotting.
So is it the same problem in the private sector? Because maintenance is often one of the first things that's cut when people are looking at cost cut in the private sector.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I mean, I've spoken to people who said, the thing, when you've seen good examples of asset management maturity, it's often been when it's perhaps something that they're doing on behalf of the government. So it's been outsourced to the private sector. And part of their agreement is to do the asset management well, right? And the return of the asset in good condition at the end of the contract and those sorts of things. That they are then become very focused on the quality of asset management because it makes a big difference to the bottom line at the end of the day. And so there's a kind of big incentive to sort it out. So, if you get the incentives right, I think the private sector has proven to be very good at asset management. I think the public sector has a different challenge around the politics of asset management, which I think which cause it difficulties, which misalign incentives effectively.
I think the short-term profit motive sometimes within very senior levels of companies. If a private company has people in very senior positions who have driven by short-term profit motives, you don't need to have a long-term outlook on the performance of the company. Then reducing your maintenance or your maintenance planning and inspections is a relatively cheap way of improving your bottom line at the detriment to the company.
Yes.
But serving your own personal financial interests.
And that is mirrored in the public sector in a different way. So maintenance of assets is a long-term game, right? Talking about assets that are there for often decades, maybe of a century or more, right? But politicians' lifespan is, if they're lucky, 4 years. And for ministers, it can often be even less, maybe 2 years. And so there is an incentive for them to cut short-term maintenance, right, at the expense of long-term performance of the assets. Which then means over time, your performance is going to deteriorate. So your train's going to be late. You're going to have more potholes in your roads. Safety features will deteriorate, et cetera, right? And that is a fundamental structural problem that we have around maintenance of assets in transport and other agencies as well across government. But that is a clash of incentives, and it's a real problem because you'd never know that you can get away with a couple of years typically of, significantly reducing maintenance. Right, without seeing a massive drop-off in performance straight away. But it's very expensive because when the assets do deteriorate, you're then doing it in a reactive way, which is much more expensive than proactive maintenance.
Yes.
Before things break. So you end up with worse performance of your assets, so worse performance of customer service, more trains delayed or cancelled, and your maintenance becomes more expensive in the longer term as well because you're now having these assets have not been kept in good repair.
Yeah. So how do we break that political incentive?
It's a really difficult one, and it's been exacerbated by the current trend around fares. So when governments want to be popular at the moment, doing things like free or cheaper fares, as we've seen in various places around the world, is very popular. And how do governments typically pay for it? Well, do they provide a big chunk of money to transport in order to fund those lower fares and increase the subsidy? Not really. What they'll often do is they'll say, you'll need to find savings in your maintenance budget, improve efficiency in your maintenance budget, and you'll be fine. And in reality, what happens is they don't actually improve the efficiency of the maintenance budget, of how it's spent. What they actually do is they reduce the amount of maintenance they're doing. And so what happens over time is your cheap fares will mean will actually translate to worse service because you're going to be maintaining your assets much less than you would have been doing otherwise. You've got less money to replace aging buses, aging trains. You've got less money to fix potholes and all the rest of it. So it's often you see people only see the one side of the equation. They don't see the other side of the equation, as always in transport.
Yeah.
So they don't understand the unintended consequences of these things.
Yeah. So just to be clear, that there's been, from what the evidence you've seen, there's been no offsets in transport budgets from Treasury departments for the discounted or free public transport.
So it varies, right? Yeah. But it's rarely full cost recovery, right? So a government makes a policy, right? It may provide some of the money, but it won't replace all of the money. So it'll tell transport to make efficiency savings. And don't get me wrong, I think there's lots of opportunities for transport agencies to make efficiency savings in many, many ways. But what typically happens is the way that they make those efficiency savings, because it's the easiest if you're in middle management of transport, is to go, we'll just reduce the amount of maintenance we're doing and pretend we're being more efficient. Because no one's actually measuring because they haven't got the records around the assets. They're not seeing the assets deteriorate faster, which is then transparent to people who know what's actually going on, right? And therefore can say, no, this isn't an efficiency improvement. This is you've just cut your maintenance budget and the maintenance of your assets.
Yeah. And this will get even worse when the asset maintenance is outsourced, because the next time they tender, the target dollar value is lower, so you'll get people who will offer less or lower quality or potentially hide the quality of the work that they're doing after winning the tender.
Yeah, and so this is a bugbear. I've seen really great contract management, and I've seen contract tendering and contract management, and I've seen really bad contract tendering and contract management. And the bad contract tendering tends to be, we'll take the lowest price, right? And they don't have a really good understanding of why this company has bid the lowest price. There's not a really solid explanation of how they are doing it for such a low price. And then typically it's not. And then what happens is those contracts kick in, and what happens is things start falling apart because there was no clear way that they were going to save money. And so either the company says, we can't do as much of the maintenance as we said we were going to do, or they start cutting corners, as you say, or they threaten to give up the contract altogether because they can't make money from it. All right. And that's a really good example of really bad tendering, and I've seen that. But on the other hand, I've seen very good ones where organizations have said, here's how we are going to save money. This is what we're going to be doing, and have a very clear understanding of where they think the productivity movements are, which stand up to scrutiny and credibility. And then you can get a very good tendering outcome. And I've seen those as well.
And is that in the writing of the tender or the scoring of the tender where that difference becomes stark?
It's the scoring more than anything, because it's about credibility. I've been asked to look at tender results and sign them off as a counsellor, and we were saying we would have a position of, by default, you would think it would be the lowest price, and most of the time, it would have the biggest weighting. But one of the things we would look at is going, why is this the lowest price? How are they delivering? We've had a specification that's tight around the service we want, expecting them to deliver. Are we confident they can deliver this level of service with the price they've bid? And if they've got a very good explanation as to why, then great. Yeah. If they don't, then often what the recommendation would be is, don't take the lowest price. We don't believe they can deliver on it. We don't believe that the service will be what we expect from, what we're expecting. And so, you're kind of making those calls about, and there's a little bit of, it's qualitative, not just quantitative, but what you've got is an experienced group of people who are assessing the tender and going, I can see what they're trying to do here. I think it's credible, or I see what they're trying to do and it's just not credible.
So, yeah.
I've seen both.
Yeah. Yeah. So
my experience with this is so much of, I think, government. It's not whether you outsource something is good or bad,
Mm,
or whether something's in the private sector or the public sector. It's about how well it's done, right? There's lots of
mm.
examples of in transport of the public sector running really good services, and there's lots of examples of the private sector doing really good services, and vice versa. Public sector being a disaster and private sector being a disaster. And it's true on contracts as well. There's lots of examples of contracts, in a particular area going out to the private sector and being run really well. And there's examples of them being run really badly. And similarly, there's examples where they've been kept in-house by government and it's been bad. And there's been examples of where it's been kept in-house by government and been really good. It's really about the quality rather than anything else, right? And of what you do rather than whether it's outsourced or insourced or whatever.
Yeah, and the level of care and the incentives.
Yeah. So contract
Yeah.
management is a skill,
Mm,
right? It is a competency, right? It is not as simple as we'll just outsource this thing. You have to be good at it. You have to
yeah.
develop that capability within your organization if you're going to have large numbers of contracts outsourced. The amount of times we see franchise agreements in transport, which are just not very good.
Mm,
There's still a lot of immaturity in franchise agreements. And I've spoken to, consultants who've just said, I've seen an in-house team who didn't have the capacity and capability to do a outsource a contract in various areas, right? Thought they could do it themselves, and it's been a disaster. And you could said I could predict that they didn't have the people, right? They didn't have the knowledge to do it, right?
yeah,
It's not just following turning the handle. You need to have people who are skilled in these areas.
and I think that's where having seen lawyers do contract management, particularly in franchising, rather than people actually understand public transport operations, the lawyers get very focused on the numerical KPIs and the compliance with the contract rather
Yeah,
than the outcome of the patrons, customers actually having a good service.
yeah. And I've seen, different lawyers I've seen have different approaches on these things.
Mm,
So, I've seen that extreme on the lawyers, but I've also seen the other end where I've seen the lawyers are saying the contract is about what happens if things go wrong,
mm,
not it's right. What you're trying to do here is design that it doesn't go wrong, right? So design it so it doesn't go wrong. My job is just to to mop up as a lawyer if it does go wrong, but make sure you're getting it right, all right? So that you never have to rely on the contract in a way, all
yeah.
right? That's a much healthier position. If you're spending your whole time, having to go back to the contract to see whether or not this issue is covered in the contract, you have a problem with the relationship that you have.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, franchising, particularly where you have the lowest cost bid approach, is fraught because the franchisee will always be making claims for variations because they have no other way of making a profit, and the contract manager will be holding them to the literal letter of the contract
Yeah.
because they've awarded a contract which is the lowest price contract, as
Uh,
you said, without necessarily the people having the right skills or experience to deliver.
yeah. Because, it may be that they put in a bid that is the lowest, but they have a credible plan for why it is lower than their competitors. They have some secret source of one sort or another, which says, look, this is why we can do this and other competitors cannot.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe there's something that they have, and that's how they're going to do it. It's credible, it's substantiated and evidence based, and you go, okay, we can accept that.
Mm,
But if it's like, we're just getting the lowest bid, and it's like, why are you lower than these people? And I can't see why,
mm,
right? That's a red flag for me.
yeah. 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 Interesting. All right. Well, let's talk about when it comes time to replace the asset, because uh, you don't really say. Well, do you really see, ministers or secretaries of state going, "Hey, we're going to replace this bridge, two-track bridge over a small country laneway."
You do actually like ribbon cutting is a big thing around assets, actually.
About renewals
Yeah.
and maintenance, yeah.
N- New trains is a good example. Okay. We're going to replace the old trains that are 50 years old with new trains. Or
Oh
when I
yeah,
was in
yes,
Okay. When I was in New South Wales, we're talking about, 2015, 2016, we had trains from the 1970s that still didn't have air conditioning. And for
mm,
those not aware, it gets very hot in the summer. So non-air conditioned
yeah,
trains are not a good thing, right? And they were way past their sell by date. They were very, very unreliable, breaking down all the time. They slowed the network down as well because they didn't have the acceleration. When you're trying to run 12 trains or more an hour, all sorts of problems with them. Okay, so we made a very strong case for we need to replace these things. And it was a big thing that we were getting the last non-air conditioned fleet off the network, and that was a big thing. You then looked at other trains which were aging and poor customer service, and so poor customer experience. You're replacing those with trains that are a better customer experience. That's a good thing. That's a good announcement. I think that's a positive. Also, when you do asset renewals, you also often end up with other types of improvements for customers as well. So just in the last couple of weeks, New South Wales announced that it had awarded its tender for the upgrade of the ticketing system, the Opal ticketing system. And one of the weaknesses of the old system was it didn't enable people with electronic accounts, so not the non-card accounts, to benefit from some of the discounts and benefits of the full card system, whereas the new system does enable them to benefit from that. So there's an improvement in terms of the customer experience as a consequence of that. And so you can make it's not just it's a new asset, but it's the same level of a service. It's actually an improvement for a lot of people from the new system. So renewals can actually significantly improve it.
Yeah. Road maintenance often brings the section of road up to current standards as well, rather than. So if you're doing a major renewals, then the road's generally upgraded to meet current standards. So all the lane widths, line marking, safety barriers, clear zones, run off the road crashes are generally done at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in New South Wales, we had a program called Bridges for the Bush, which was basically regional bridges, right? And upgrading regional bridges. And local communities loved it because they knew their bridges were, old, run down, often only single lane bridges, not capable of carrying the volumes of traffic they were experiencing in their areas.
Yeah.
So they can be very popular. The thing I would say, though, is the amount of we've got to be thinking about, especially your large renewals, right? You need to be planning for those. So if you're spending time on replacing your train fleet, and I think one of the things I think we get wrong on replacing train fleets, a couple of things we get wrong on replacing train fleets is we do it in big lumps. So we procure we'll replace a train set every 30 years or something in a big, let's buy 30 trains. They'll be delivered over a 3-year period or something like that. Right. And one of the historic problems is that money is not set aside or planned for to replace those trains.
Yeah.
So the amount of train sets around the world where they're well past their sell-by date and they should have been renewed, but the money wasn't there when it was needed is substantial, right? Because the planning hasn't been done to make sure that the money is available. Now, in New South Wales, they tried to get around that by effectively setting money aside in a state-owned corporation, where they would pay the state-owned corporation every year, effectively as a sort of to pay for the asset renewal as and when it came up.
Right.
The problem with that was that the government was borrowing effectively to sit a whole load of money sitting on a balance sheet doing not a lot, which didn't make sense either, right? So it wasn't the right solution. But there is something in that they do need to be planning very large outcomes. We're talking billions of dollars in train replacements. You do need to be working out how you're going to fund that. And you don't want to be getting to we now need to fund these next year. We need to find several $billion extra is not a great way of thinking about, replacing your assets. You need to be doing it in a much more systematic and long-term horizon way.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that unfortunately we're very good at doing in Australia is saying we're unique. We must have unique products.
Unique assets. Yeah.
Yes.
Our assets need to be coping with being attacked by kangaroos. It's very important.
True, but the Sydney Metro is probably the only type of train set in the last 30 years that we've just bought off the shelf.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
I think when we bought the new Waratahs, it was 95% the same specification as the previous generation of Waratahs.
Yeah, but the Waratah itself was a bespoke product.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Which ran late. And
absolutely.
And the predecessor, the Millennium's bespoke product that ran late.
I agree.
And the predecessor, the Tangaras,
I agree.
bespoke.
But at some point, something goes from it was bespoke then, but if we've been buying enough of them, is it still bespoke? There's a kind of line. But
yeah, well, Yeah,
But I agree with you. The point is, we could buy a lot cheaper and
yes.
a perfectly adequate product that the rest of the world enjoys by just buying standardized products.
Yeah. Though there is a good Australian counter to that, which is the HSTs that were bought from the United Kingdom in the early 90s, which were then called XPT. So the HST set was a high speed diesel set run all over the UK. It actually wasn't up to Australian climatic conditions because it was designed for the UK. So when they were bought, they needed a lot of retrofitting. But I think there's also a factor of, well, now you could go, okay, well, there's plenty of other places in the world with similar climatic, conditions. So, perhaps for Sydney, the Stadler Kiss that runs in for Caltrain in the Bay Area would be a suitable vehicle to buy off the shelf as a bi-level train set.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back, it's not just the trains, right? It's electric buses. And it goes back to our point about why have we still got a couple of states who have not actually certified electric buses yet?
Oh, trials of electric buses. Yeah, we've got to keep on trialing them.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's
yeah,
okay.
we're so
We bought 150 last month out of
yeah.
20,000.
So we're bad at buying assets. We're bad at knowing what assets we actually own. We're bad at knowing what condition they're in. We're bad at maintaining them. We're bad at doing renewals. It's not a pretty picture, is it, on assets?
Well, there is one piece which I think actually saves us, and that's that there's lots of really hardworking, dedicated people.
So
Which is
there are.
why we don't have the big disasters that happen in other parts of the world yet.
Yeah, I
Cross
agree with
fingers,
that.
touch wood.
And I also would say that we don't have a shortage of asset management professionals who know their stuff and know what they're doing, right? So the question is, why are they not able, right, to get the outcomes? And I think there's several interesting quirks in here. The first thing is asset management, and you hinted at this when we first started this blog, right? This podcast, which is lots of people switch off on asset management. Right? Their brain just switches off. And that's true at senior levels of transport organizations. Even though assets are fundamental to the operations of everything we do in transport, the number of senior leaders who don't understand asset maintenance and asset management is very high, right? I would even go to say as far as most senior leadership teams don't have someone on their team who understands asset management really well, right? It's given to somebody who, lower down in the organization. So there's no champion around the leadership table for understanding strategic asset management. So that's a problem. So inevitably, that's a big barrier. The other thing is my experience has been with the asset management experts, there's kind of an expectation that you've got to get up to speed with their language rather than them explaining it in terms that non-asset management experts can understand. And I think that's a communication gap that we need to close as well, because I think it's part of the reason why we don't make good asset management decisions is because it's a topic that was not communicated and understood well as a result.
And I suppose which set of people counting beans is the problem? Is it the engineers or the accountants? Speaking as an engineer who counts beans.
You're probably better informed than me on that. I mean, I think the asset managers struggle to make the case for good asset management because they don't talk in a language which is understood often by the accountants.
Yeah.
Right. Who can then kind of recommend and go, no, we need to be doing this asset maintenance. We need to find ways of funding it. Because I think people, good finance people who understand good asset management are few and far between. And the ones that you've got, you need those people in transport, right? You need people in the transport space and in the finance areas who understand assets. I think that's a fundamental skill for chief financial officers in transport. And how that translates into good operations and reduces costs in the long term and all the rest of it. Chief financial officers should be one of the big champions of asset management, really, within a transport organization.
Well, and like you said before, it's not just transport because, if you go to the space shuttle O-ring issue, there was a decision made in the design to not have a specification for sub-zero temperatures because they never gets to sub-zero temperatures in Florida when we're trying to launch. And the day before there was a sub-zero temperature and the O-ring wasn't up to
Broke.
standard
Yep.
for that and failed. And unfortunately, you had the tragic result. So when, the engineers and designers and maintenance people being able to communicate the importance of their decision in terms of a risk framework. If we don't maintain the bridge this year, then that increases the probability of the bridge falling down.
Yeah. I mean, the shuttle example that you gave gives a really interesting challenge in the sense of, how many people in that room would have been able to connect? We had a sub-zero temperature yesterday, so that we were following the weather,
Mm,
right? And knew that the assets weren't designed to cope with it, and that therefore the risk had become there was a significant increase in risk for the
mm.
launch, right? The number of people that could have joined those dots would have been very small.
The people who did join the dots weren't listened to
Yeah, as
because
well,
they couldn't communicate the gravity of the risk. Or if they did
right?
communicate the gravity of the risk, then it's like, oh, well, you're just engineer trying to scare us. It'll be fine
Yes.
because engineers are trained on being scared. We are, everything we do is safety margins because we know the consequences of not having safety margins.
Yeah. And, typically when we do see disasters in transport space, it's often it's not one mistake, right? It's
Mm,
often a whole series of things that go wrong, right? That result in it, right? So the safety system on each one failed, right? On three or four different aspects often within the system failed.
mm,
It's not that one thing because the specification wasn't the fundamental problem, right? The fact, on the shuttle's case, as you say, it was like that was one of the problems, but the other problem then became, well, we weren't able to communicate the importance of that. Then it was the person making the decision wasn't able to make an informed decision about that. All of those things had a big
mm,
impact. Um,
mm.
and, people's lives were lost, and that's what we see typically. It's sad.
Yeah, it is. So to round out and maybe end on a bit more of a positive note, let's talk about optimizing. What's a first good step to having improved asset management?
So the thing I would say is a commitment to very high quality strategic asset management. That needs to come from the very top, right? That needs to be bought in at both a political and a agency level to say strategic asset management is a really top high priority for us. And what's interesting is you're starting to see that creep into some transport strategies. So
Mm,
you're starting to see, so I think I read the Dutch transport strategy last year. And effectively, strategic asset management was one of the core pillars that they had within their transport strategy. Now, you know as well as I do that there's often a gap between transport strategy and delivery, but historically, strategic asset management has not often made it into transport strategies. So for me, it's a good sign that we are starting to see it in transport strategies. That's kind of an indication that people are recognizing its importance.
mm,
Time will tell whether that then translates into genuine improvements in strategic asset management or not. But I think that's a first sign. And what that means, I think, is in that buying in is people need to understand what that means, and you need to understand, well, where are we on that level of sophistication on asset management at the moment? Are we a 1 out of 5 or a 2 out of 5? And how quickly can we go from a 2 out of 5 to a 4 out of 5 and then go on to a 5 out of 5? So for me, it's very much that kind of strategic management focus is the first thing that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think this is I've been seeing disaster resilience as a form of asset management, covering off asset management in response to significant changes in the seriousness of the weather events from climate change. So it's quite interesting seeing it covered under that. We need good quality assets that are actually going to survive the impact of natural disasters as they increase in frequency. So, which requires maintenance and inspections and significant upgrades of materials and facilities.
Yeah.
Which
I mean,
which have their costs.
most Western agencies, in most transport agencies in developed countries have been doing a lot of work at looking at what they need to invest in order to make their assets resilient. And
Mm,
it's very large, right? We're talking huge amounts of money to deal with flooding, bushfires, very extreme temperatures.
yeah.
It's big bills. historically would have just come out of, the asset management budget, right? And so this is before you're even just talking about keeping the assets in the condition they are today, let
Yeah.
alone, improving them from where they are, because often they're run down. So it's
Yeah.
a big challenge.
Yeah. Okay. Any closing thoughts around that?
The thing I would say is, if you are someone who is an asset manager, work out how to communicate your ideas better. And if you are someone in a leadership position, right, whether it's finance, operations, strategy, etc., understand the important, go out, reach out and find out the importance of asset management and what good asset management looks like, because it's a core part of delivering a really great transport system.
Yeah. And I would say on the project side of things, don't try and reinvent the wheel. Just find, because if that happens on every project, then you don't actually have an asset set that can be managed.
We are going to have to do an episode on how to bring down the costs of projects in Australia, because they're so expensive, right? And that's just one of many things we should be doing to reduce the costs of our projects.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Project development.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, it's not just applicable to Australia. It's the Anglosphere has a significant problem with every project being bespoke. And we, very definitely need to learn from the French and the Spanish and maybe not so much the Germans at the moment, but maybe, the Swiss.
Yeah, the Chinese have done a good job on it with regards to high-speed rail, although I think they've overbuilt it. Their efficiency is very impressive.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, with that, thanks again, Russell.
Thank you, Graham. Great to talk to you as always.
Yeah. If you like what we're doing, please share it around in all the various platforms. And if you're so kind, chuck us $1 or $2 so we can pay for a better quality production and enable us to get more guests.
Oh, thank you very much, Graham. Great to speak to you as always.
Thanks, Russell.